So last class we talked about schedules of reinforcement. We talked about what fixed and variable mean, what ratio and interval mean, and then putting it all together. In the video prior to this, not only do we go through all of the schedules, but we also go through some examples, and I think that should help you understand those concepts. So we're just going to move to kind of the next section here, and that is application of operant conditioning. So we talk about how to train your dog, for example, training your dog how to sit, training your dog how to roll over, and you shape that behavior. But it's much more than that in terms of applying it in the field. So in psychology, how do we take operant conditioning and actually do something and make use out of it? Well, depending on what particular field you're in, we can actually apply this in several different ways. And remember that the operant conditioning techniques are kind of based off of rather simple principles, but they can help improve behavior. It can help increase good behaviors and decrease bad behaviors. And so these are definitely things that we see being used in the field. For example, in clinical psychology, if you have counterproductive behaviors, for example, if you have a person who wants to stop smoking, who has an unhealthy relationship with food and wants to stop overeating, we can see, especially with healthful behaviors, we can see how operant conditioning can sometimes play a really good role in getting people to decrease those bad behaviors and increase the good ones. So for example, for smoking, try to reinforce good behavior and not smoking after eating, for example, and starting with that, and rewarding yourself every time that you engage in a good behavior. In sports training, it can help aid in performance. We're seeing, for example, somebody come in with poor form. You can help correct that behavior with reinforcement. You can help improve concentration and using things like meditation and reinforcement and helping people better concentrate in their sport. When it comes to working with students, whether we're talking about children in the classroom or we're talking about college students, we can use the same principles to help with studying behavior and increasing grades and academic performance. If we have young children in the classroom who are engaging in really bad disruptive behaviors and we need those children to sit in their desk and listen, we can do that with things like sticker charts. Or now what's really popular is using apps like Class Dojo. And so parents are also in on the app as well. And so if a teacher says that, this particular student was disrespectful, or if this particular student was getting out of their chair and talking too much in class, then they can actually set up on Class Dojo, for example, a bad dojo where the student gets a poor point or a point taken away. Or if they're doing good and they're doing, good behaviors, then then the parents can actually see that in real time when the teacher is applying those Class Dojos. And if, for example, the student gets 4 bad ones in a row, that might mean a trip to the principal's office. And so these kinds of techniques are really good to help keep students and kids, especially in younger kids, keep them disciplined in the classroom. And then finally, we've talked about industrial organizational psychology before. In IO psychology, they're interested in getting the employees to work in a productive way, work efficiently. And if you want to increase productivity, you want your employees to be efficient and happy. And so you, of course, if you take an employee and you consistently tell them they're doing a good job and you're getting them to really feel good about their work, then that's going to actually improve their productivity and make them better employees and more likely to stay in your business because they feel appreciated. And so if you want people to actually, stick with your company and you want your employees to be efficient and productive, then there are definitely ways that you can do that with operant conditioning. Okay, so moving a bit off of operant conditioning and talking about learning behavior, we're gonna go into another kind of cognitive behavior that happens here, called learned helplessness. Now, learned helplessness was a term that really came about from Seligman's work. And so learned helplessness means that if you're exposed to an inescapable and uncontrollable aversive event, okay, and you feel like you can't get out, and you feel like no matter what you do, it's not going to change anything, it'll actually produce very passive behavior. So if you believe that whatever you do, whatever behavior you engage in will have no effect on your environment, it make you become passive. It make you become to the point where you feel like no matter what you do, you're stuck. And so if you experience learned helplessness, you learn to be helpless because no matter what you do, you don't feel like you're ever going to get out of your situation. And Seligman started this work in dogs, actually, and figured out that if you put dogs in certain situations, they actually react differently than dogs who are put in other situations where they have an out. Now, I'm going to give you guys an example of this by drawing on the whiteboard here. And so I actually do not have terrible drawing skills, but when I draw on my own, I seem to have really bad drawing skills. So just bear with me here. And we're going to do a dog here. And so this particular dog and this is kind of like how his experiment went. So he would put a dog in a sort of box, and this would have an electric grid on the floor. So in scenario 1, he would have the dog stand in the box, and then he would electrify the floor. And he would do it over and over again, and the dog would then get to the point where it would just lie down on the floor because there was nowhere to go. There was nowhere to escape. Then what happened is after the dog got to the point where it knew that the floor was going to be shocked and it had nowhere to go, Seligman would put it in a box where it would have an opening here. So we're going to say it looked something like this. Okay. Say it didn't have a top. And it had a barrier right there. And on this side, it had a floor, but it was not shocked. It was just a plain floor. And so the dog would sit in the box, and so they would electrify the floor, but the dog would stay right here. It wouldn't go anywhere. It learned to take the electric shock, and because it never knew anything other than this situation, it didn't even realize that it could jump over here and get away from it. Now, for the other dogs who have been in situations where they had the opportunity to go from one place to the next place, if you put a dog in this situation with a place to escape initially, then the dog will learn that it can go to the other floor and escape the electric shock. But if the dog is never exposed to a situation where it can remove itself from the electric grid, even when presented after the fact, with a potential opportunity to escape, it won't. And so this is what is referred to as learned helplessness. The dog learns to become helpless in this particular situation. Now, when it comes to humans, Seligman applied this to human issues and said, for example, if you are depressed and feel like you're in a hole and you feel like you're never going to dig yourself out of that hole, then you will give in and say, I'm never going to get better. So he developed techniques to essentially break this idea of learned helplessness and teach people that they can get out of their situation with the right tools and the right skill set. And those people who are habitual pessimists, who believe that, the situation will never get better, there's no good side to look to, they're not optimistic in any way, and they feel very down, he tried to help people see that there are situations that you should look positively at, and if you change the way that you see things, then you're going to be more likely to be able to get out of that situation and get out of that depressive state. And his techniques are used today and are very, very helpful in getting people out of situations like depression, but also situations where we see a lot of domestic violence because we see partner violence. So if one person is living with someone else who's very abusive and they feel like they can't get out of that situation, then using these techniques that Seligman developed can actually teach them that they can actually get out of this situation with the right resources and the right opportunity. So it's been very helpful for people to kind of get out of the rut that they might experience. Now, here's a nice table that goes through all of the concepts that we've covered in this class so far about classical conditioning and operant conditioning. And remember, the major difference between classical conditioning is this involuntary behaviors, like we used Pavlov's example of salivation with dogs, any kind of emotion, happiness, sadness, hunger, sexual desire, all of those things are sort of reflexive involuntary behaviors. Whereas operant conditioning, we see voluntary behaviors, the animal or person choosing to behave in a situation and then a consequence coming from that particular behavior, then we see is that behavior repeated or not. So these right here are some really good compare contrast of classical and operant conditioning that I think will help you digest it even better. So moving on to another kind of learning is where we get to observational learning. Now, observational learning is a really interesting phenomenon and something that you can kind of see even in your own family. For example, Albert Bandura was a psychologist who really paved the way for our understanding of observational learning. And one way that he did this was through his use of the Bobo doll study. Now, we're going to get to that in a minute. But really what he demonstrated is that people learn from watching other people. So, for example, if you have a brother and a sister or siblings, and let's say your sister goes out and does something that upsets your parents, okay? Let's say she goes and gets her tongue pierced, I don't know, and maybe that upsets your parents. You can use that. You can observe what she went through. Maybe she got grounded. Maybe, she got something taken away from her, like a car or something. And then you say, okay, well, you know what? I'm not going to do that because she got punished for it. And so you're learning through observation. You observed her behavior and it changed the likelihood of you doing that. And so that's really down to the basics what observational learning is. You're watching someone being rewarded or reinforced for a behavior, or you can watch somebody being punished, and that's going to change the likelihood if you're going to actually behave or not. So in the case of Bandura, he was able to show that children who watch particular behaviors, in the case of acting out on a toy, if they watched adults act out on a toy, then get reinforced for that, they were rewarded for that violent behavior, they were more likely to engage in that behavior when they had the toy to play with. Now, before we get into the specifics of the study, I want to go over some of the 4 basic processes that are important to know when it comes to observational learning. Number 1 is attention. So Albert Bandura said that the first step to observational learning is that the attention has to be there. So the individual has to notice something in the environment, has to be paying attention to the behavior that is later going to be imitated. And if the person isn't paying attention, then that first step of observational learning can't even happen because nothing's being observed. Number 2 is retention. So when it comes to paying attention to the behavior, then the person is to remember what was noticed. They have to form and store some sort of mental representation of the behavior that's going to be imitated. So they have to retain it. Number 3 is reproduction. This means that the individual produces an action that is in a copy of what was noticed. So they're imitating the behavior. They transform that mental representation. They've retained it. They've transformed the mental representation into an action that can be performed. So the person copies what they saw in the form of a repeated behavior. And then finally is motivation. So it's not just enough to reproduce the behavior. We have to see a consequence from this. So reinforcement and punishment. So the environment has to deliver a consequence that changes the probability if the behavior is going to be emitted again. So for example, I have 2 young children and they listen to everything that I say. Unfortunately and fortunately, even if they don't act like they're paying attention. If I drop a curse word, let's say I say shit, and my youngest son, who's about to turn 2, is paying attention and hears me say shit. Okay? They hear me say it. He hears me say it. He's paying attention. He has noticed something in the environment. Now he needs to retain this. He's got to remember what was said and in what context it was said. Then he's going to reproduce this behavior, usually in the worst possible setting, right in front of, like, a nana or a grandma or something. And if he reproduces a behavior after retaining it, he runs around and says, shit. Now, the consequence, the next step, the motivation, this all determines if that behavior, that imitated behavior, continues or not. So, if he says shit, and if a toddler says that, I might laugh. And if I laugh, then he is going to get reinforced for saying that bad word. And that means that in the future, he's going to be more likely to say it again. Whereas if I say, no, you should not say that, okay, then that's going to change the likelihood that he's going to emit that behavior again. But chances are he'll be reinforced in some way and then continue to say that bad word just because that's parenting. But anyway, so those are the 4 basic processes involved with observational learning. We have attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation. Now, with Bandura's Bobo doll study, he did this in the 1960s. And so what he did is this, and there's a nice video here, but I just want to kind of explain the basics. You can see the video, it's kind of neat. So up at the top here, this is a film reel of what the children observed. So this right here in the case of a woman, and sometimes it's a man, sometimes it's a woman. It just, they varied up who was doing what. And this is a Bobo doll, which is a clown. It's, blown up and it's got a weighted bottom. And so you can punch it and you can play with it however you want. And so in this case, the children watched the woman throw it up in the air. She punches it. You can see that she's doing some karate moves here and kicks the Bobo doll. Now, these children right here were the ones who actually this is a hammer, that's right. So these children right here were the ones who actually watched this film reel, and they engaged in imitating behavior. They imitated exactly, so here you can see this boy here took the hammer and did the same thing with it. This little girl's kicking it. And they imitated the behavior that they witnessed the adult do. And they did that because the adult was reinforced or rewarded for the behavior after she engaged in all of these sort of violent behaviors. And so Bandura said that basically, because they were reinforced for this particular behavior, that they were going to then repeat that behavior. And so he was making the point that if you, for example, are in a situation where you have children around and you're engaging in violent, aggressive behavior, that those kids, are probably they're going to see it, they're going to notice it. If they can retain it, they're probably going to imitate that behavior, especially if they're not getting punished for it, and in this case, being rewarded. So after the series of several different experiments, we've kind of got a nice list of factors that are involved that will increase the likelihood that you're going to imitate a particular behavior. So one, obviously, that we learned from the Bobo study, if a person is rewarded for that behavior, they're going to be more like that other person's going to be more likely to repeat it. So if you have a sibling who makes straight A's, that sibling is given $20 for every A, then you're going to go, ooh, wait a second, maybe I need to make straight A's because then I can get money as well. We tend to imitate warm, nurturing people, people that we feel like we relate to, people that we like. We tend to want to imitate those. If a person has control over you, or if you feel like they're an authority figure, we tend to be more likely to imitate them, especially if they have power to influence you. If a person is similar to you, whether it's by age, sex, or interest, we tend to be more likely to imitate those. This is where we see a lot of fashion choices, right? People imitating others and then engaging in very similar fashion for each sort of age range. If you perceive somebody as having a higher social status, you might imitate them, because then, of course, the reinforcement is that you will also have a higher social status if you do this. We see Instagram influencers, for example, social media influencers, being influencing because people imitate their behaviors. They use their products, they buy the same products, they do the same sorts of things, follow the same fashion choices, do the same makeup trends, for example, do all those sorts of things because of their social status. If you are doing a task and if the task that you're supposed to do is not extremely easy, or if it's really difficult, we tend to kind of go with someone else's behavior because we're not sure. So, and this kind of falls in the same sort of category. If you're not sure if you know what you're doing, then you're going to be more likely to imitate someone else's behavior and copy what they're doing. So if I put you in a group, for example, with 3 other people, and I give you a really ambiguous assignment, so like here, and I said, hey, just do your best. And if the task is extremely difficult, then you might feel lost. But if somebody in your group acts like they know what they're doing, then everybody in the group is just going to copy them, because they're going to go, well, you seem you know what you're doing. I don't know what's going on here because it's ambiguous, and I'm not confident in my own skills, so we're just going to go with your answer. Same thing if you go in a trivia group and you are all a part of a team, and 3 of the people are super not confident with the answer, but the other person seems to know what they're talking about. You're going to go with them because you're going to copy what they're doing and say, hey, let's go with your answer because they seem confident. If you've been rewarded for imitating in the past that same behavior, then you're going to be more likely to imitate it again in the future. For example, if my toddler decides to say a bad word, then if he comes on to another bad word, I'm going, and if we all laugh and think it's funny, then he's going to be more likely to continue to imitate and copy that behavior over and over and over again. Now, when it comes to another kind of this kind of observational learning, we know that it serves a purpose for us, for our survival. Obviously, being able to observe people and be able to imitate them, to do similar behaviors is helpful because it helps us learn even more. You can imitate someone's behavior, for example. When my youngest son was learning how to sort of move his legs, and before he was really learning how to crawl, my older son would get on the floor and move his legs, and so my younger son would copy him, and this built his muscles and built his skills in being able to move his legs. And so being able to imitate someone crawling when we're learning how to crawl, someone walking when we're learning to walk, these are very basic things that help us build these skills. When you're learning a new skill, when you're maybe learning how to paint, or learning how to draw, or learning how to swing a golf club, you may imitate a particular behavior, and then at some point you can build on that and learn your own. Outside of imitation, you can learn your own sort of skill. And so it's a great way for us to learn all sorts of different kinds of behaviors, what to do, what not to do, and also how to read a social situation. If somebody is in a classroom, for example, let's say the first day of class, and people don't raise their hand and they all start shouting and they don't get in trouble for it, then you go, okay, well, I'm watching what they're doing, I'm observing their behavior, I'm going to engage in it, and I'm getting reinforced for this, so I'm going to continue this behavior. Well, then you've learned sort of a social rule in that given situation. If you go to a funeral and everyone's somber and quiet, you're going to imitate the behavior if you've never been to a funeral before, and you learn, okay, this is how I'm expected to behave. So observational learning is very important to our social, our developmental, every sort of aspect of our life. But the question is how does this work? How are our brains sort of built to be able to to engage in observational learning? Well, one idea comes from mirror neurons. So mirror neurons, very interestingly, is a network of neurons where when we engage in a particular behavior, for example, let's say we're kicking a ball, there are particular neurons that are firing. The neurons are firing in your motor cortex to allow you to swing your foot, engage how hard you need to kick the ball, how fast you need to kick the ball. All of these neurons, let's say if you were able to show them actually working, would activate throughout different parts of your brain. Well, it turns out the same neurons that activate when you are physically doing a motion versus when you're watching a motion that you've done before, like kicking a ball, you watch somebody kick a ball, there are a series of network of neurons that activate the same. So when you're doing a task versus that you've done before, that you're watching someone else do the task, we see the same mirror neurons activate. And in this particular example, over here on the right, you see that this A is a person who is not musically talented or trained, okay? This is just somebody off the street. They learned how to play a piece of music on a keyboard, okay? And then they went to in an fMRI, and they played the music that the person learned while the person was listening. Now, interestingly, this right here, this represents the scans of the person who was listening to the same music that they learned how to play. And what you see is this red part right here. This is the motor areas activating. This is the same activation that you would see if the person was actually playing the music. It's the same network that activates when they're listening to the same music they just learned. Now, here is an example of the same person listening to music that they had not learned. This is unfamiliar music that they did not know how to play. There is no motor cortex activation here when compared to the music that they learned how to play. Now, this activation here, this right here, this is the temporal cortex. This is simply hearing the music. This is the activation that you would get when anybody's listening to music or listening to sounds. So this right here is expected. So we kind of just ignore that because we know that that's going to light up because people are listening to music. What we're interested in is, are the mirror neurons and motor cortex, is it lighting up? And it's not when the person has not been has not played that music before. So what do we think mirror neurons do? Well, one, it helps us engage in observational learning, but also it may play a role in empathy, being able to put ourselves in other people's shoes and say, hey, I understand how you feel. So sympathy is just saying, okay, I get it. I get how you feel. I feel sorry for you. I feel you in this situation. Whereas empathy is a step further. It's saying, okay, I can put myself in your shoes and I really relate to the feelings that you're experiencing. So it's a more complex emotion than just sympathy of feeling sorry for someone. We also think it plays a role in language and our ability to be able to learn language to the capacity that we can. And then obviously social cognition, understanding how we need to act in certain social situations, that we code switch based on if we're talking to friends versus a professor versus our parents versus our grandparents. How do we behave in certain situations, and how do we use our social scripts in society? Interestingly, we think that autism, people who have autism may have some issues with the fact that they may actually not have their mirror neuron network may not function the same way, or it might not be as strong as a person without autism. And so autism is a condition where we see people having issues with understanding how to act in certain social situations, being able to pick up on social cues. And so it's not natural for them to engage in the right kinds of behaviors given certain social situations. And so it may be that the mirror neurons, the network might be not functioning properly. Now, this also brings us to this question of if we all engage in observational learning, and this is something that we're going to imitate any behavior that we see, what about situations where we see people watching very violent television, very violent media, playing, violent video games? Does that mean that everyone who watches that is going to imitate that behavior and engage in that? So violent video games has been a really, really big one that has been studied for decades, and it really started with Columbine. And when Columbine happened, that was a really big deal. So that happened in the 90s, where a couple of kids went and shot up a school. And so everyone blamed violent video games. They said that these kids were playing violent video games. It made them violent. They imitated the behavior. They were playing first-person shooter games, so they wanted to live that out by imitating it, by going in their school and shooting kids that bullied them. And so this started a major line of research. So Columbine really started a major line of research of looking at violent video games and saying this is what's causing people to be violent. And at first, a lot of the work came back, and everyone said, okay, well, this is true, that this watching violent shows and engaging in playing these games do make you more violent. But the problem was that all of these conclusions were correlational in nature. So we know that if something is correlational, we can't say that it necessarily causes it. There's just a link there. There's an association. So we've learned that a lot of the conclusions that these studies came to probably were not accurate, because you don't know what that other factor might be. So maybe kids who play violent video games are more likely to engage in violence, not because they're playing violent video games, but because they come from a family where there's domestic violence or there's violence there. And so it just so happens that because they're exposed to it, they're going to be more likely to seek out violent video games, more likely to seek out violent television shows. And that's not the reason why they're imitating the behavior, but that's just sort of a product of the situation that they're in. So maybe parents are allowing them to do these violent things earlier because the parents are doing it, or watching it, or interested in it. And so there's so many factors involved here that there's no way to pinpoint exactly one. And it's not right to sit and lump everybody in the same category, because there's plenty of people, I'm sure a lot of people who are listening to this right now, who play violent video games, who haven't murdered anybody, have no intentions of murdering anybody, and they're not violent themselves. But some of the research, though, does suggest that there are situations where adolescents, for example, might engage in sexual behavior if they watch shows with sexual contact earlier in their adolescence. There is some evidence to say that adolescents or teenagers who watch a lot of pornography, they may have more sexual partners. They may be more likely to engage in substance abuse. But again, this is correlational, because maybe those adolescents who view more pornography, it's not the pornography itself that's actually causing it, but it's causing more promiscuous behavior. But it's simply that they were going to engage in that anyway. So we know that there are situations where it might have viewing violence might have a factor, might play a role in people wanting to imitate that behavior, but that's definitely not the end all be all and the cause, and one to say that everybody who watches this is going to become a violent person because they're watching violent TV. We have to be really careful about those conclusions and basically say we've got to go through and actually look at all the other factors, not just what kids are watching on TV, or what video games they're playing. It's so much more than that. It's much more involved than just simply viewing it, because observation comes from a lot of different places, right? So if they're seeing it in the home, and they're seeing it on TV, and they're seeing it in video games, that might have an additive effect. It might produce something different than just simply playing the game. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is just some ways that you as a student can improve your self-control. And this is going to help you in the process in terms of learning. You can apply this to observational learning. You can apply this to your studying. You can apply this to lots of different areas of your life. But what I really want you to think about is these strategies to help you be able to overcome the temptation that you might get from this short-term reinforcers. And if you are able to sort of delay gratification and delay some of those immediate reinforcers that might not be good for you, that actually can really help your self-control and allow you to be able to get to your end goal. So number one, strategy one is pre-commitment. So let's say you want to study tonight and you say to yourself, no matter what comes through that door, no matter who asks me, I am going to commit to studying tonight because I have a big quiz or a big exam tomorrow. So midterms are coming up. Maybe you say, look, I'm going to study tonight and that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to commit to that. So pre-commitment can help. If you don't make plans to study, then you're going to be a lot more likely to give in, for example, if somebody wants you to come to a party or if somebody wants to go out. Strategy number two is self-reinforcement. Reward yourself, right? Reward yourself when you've done something like stayed in to study. So you say tonight, I have midterms coming up. I'm going to stay in, I'm going to study, and tomorrow I'm going to go out, or tomorrow I'm going to go, have lunch with my friends, or I'm going to allow myself to buy a pair of shoes. I don't know, whatever is reinforcing to you. Strategy three is stimulus control. Don't put yourself in a position where you are setting yourself up for failure, okay? Stimulus control is when you say, okay, look, I'm not going to go to that party. I'm not going to put myself in the position or an environment where I know I'm going to get invited out. I am going to remove myself from that situation because I know that I'm going to have a hard time saying no. So let's say, someone sends you a text and says, hey, there's a party here. Telling yourself, I'm not going to check the text, or I'm not going to reply. I'm not going to put myself in a position where I feel tempted to give in. Strategy number four is focus on the delayed reinforcer. What is your prize at the end of the tunnel? So let's say you want to go to medical school and you really, really need to get a good grade in your anatomy class. So you say to yourself, my prize at the end of the tunnel is graduating with this degree, graduating with a good GPA so that I can get into medical school. So, being able to tell yourself, or maybe it's just getting to the end of the semester. I just want to get through this class, or I just want to get through this whatever to survive to the next time. Strategy number five is observe good role models. And this is simple. Find somebody that you look up to. Maybe it's somebody who's already graduated. Maybe it's somebody who's a year ahead of you. And use them if they are, really good about, they have really good GPA, or, you look up to them because they are, they know what they want to do in their life. And they're on a track and a path, and they are, bulldozing that path. Then you need to, look up to them and observe them as a good role model, because then you can be more like them. And remember, we imitate behavior, people that we, that we look up to. And so that can be a good way for you to get a really good hold of your life. Now, the last section here, this last slide, is just a review slide to help you with studying for this particular quiz. And hopefully you won't have any issues with organizing your notes, because we started out with learning and conditioning, and classical and operant conditioning, ended with observational learning, and just some tools for you to get yourself on track, especially because midterms are coming up and we are hitting the middle of the semester. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Feel free to email me. If not, we will